Welcome to the May 21st meeting of Troy City Council. I am Mark Baker, President of Council. Please silence your electronic devices for the duration of the meeting. We'll begin with the invocation by Mr. Bill Twist, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand.
If you bow your heads. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you that we live in a great city of Troy. We just ask that you would come tonight and guide our thoughts and decisions, Lord, for what's best for the city. We thank you for all those that are serving here and abroad. Just watch over them and protect them. We ask that your comforting spirit go to Santa Fe where tragedy has taken place, and comfort those families who have suffered a loss. And we'd ask a special blessing on our own children here, Lord, just to protect them and watch over them. As the school year comes to an end and summer starts, we just ask a special blessing on them. And we ask that in your name, amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Swayzer?
Here.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Here.
Mr. Sievert?
Here.
Mr. Twist?
Here.
Mr. Lutz?
Here.
Mr. Heath?
Here.
Mrs. Oda?
Here.
Mr. Kendall?
Here.
Mr. Phillips?
Here.
All members are present.
Mrs. Knight, please read a summary of the minutes of the May 7th meeting of Troy City Council.
Minutes of Council, May 7, 2018. Committee reports. Finance Committee recommended legislation be prepared authorizing a loan to the Community Improvement Corporation. And also legislation be prepared to extend the current moratorium regarding permits on the North Market Street area. Committee recommended legislation be prepared authorizing participation in the ODOT road salt bid. Law and Ordinance Committee read regarding a liquor permit transfer. Resolution number R16, 2018, loan to Community Improvement Corporation, revitalization of Sherwood Shopping Center was given first reading and adopted. Resolution number R17, 2018, participate in ODOT winter contract for salt, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 018, 2018, final plat Stonebridge Meadows, third reading. Ordinance number 020, 2018, moratorium regarding issuance and approval of occupancy permits in North Market Street area, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 021, 2018, reappropriating various funds was given first reading and adopted. Following comments, council adjourned 7:30 p.m.
Are there any additions or corrections from council?
I'll move to accept the minutes.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Heath and seconded by Mr. Phillips to accept the minutes. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer?
Yes.
Minutes are approved.
We have two reports from the Finance Committee this evening. Chairman, Mr. Tom Kendall, will you please provide those reports?
Yeah, as soon as I get it pulled up here. Yeah, I'm getting there. There we go. I get it. Okay. Thank you, Madam President. The first is CDBG programs for project year 2018. On May 16th, this committee met to review Community Development Block Grant CDBG application programs. The city is eligible to receive $150,000 of project year 2018 CDBG Community Development Allocation Grant Program funds to be used for qualifying projects. Staff has recommended the following as meeting the program criteria. $100,000 for Harrison Street, Atlantic Street water main replacement, $30,000 for sidewalk, street, corner accessibility ramp installations, $2,000 for fair housing program, and $18,000 general administration for the total of $150,000. Staff also recommended an application be submitted for $500,000 of project year 2018 CDBG Critical Infrastructure Program funding to expand the Harrison Street, Atlantic Street water main replacement project. If that grant application is approved, project funding would be also include the use of $50,000 for the CDBG funded City of Troy Economic Development Revolving Loan Fund and $100,000 from the Water Fund. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared to authorize filing an application for project year 2018 CDBG allocation grant program funds for the items discussed above. And authorizing filing an application for project year 2018 CDBG Critical Infrastructure Program funds related to expanding the Harrison Street, Atlantic Street water main replacement project and the use of the EDRLF funds for the project as well. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Swayzer, Mr. Sievert, myself as chair.
Are there any questions from council members?
Madam President, I have a question.
Mrs. Zoda?
Patrick, this morning in the paper, there was a notice of a public hearing regarding the CDBG funds. How does that play into this decision tonight?
This is the authorization to file. That is the public hearing to get input on the recommendations that staff is making. So it's all part of the process that the federal government requires us to go through.
Okay, so we're just saying go ahead and file it, and then there's still a public hearing on it?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? You may continue, Mr. Kendall.
Okay, thank you. The second item is application to use community development block grant funds for repairs to Lincoln Community Center. On May 16th, this committee met to consider authorizing an application to the Ohio Development Services Agency for repairs to be made to the Lincoln Community Center using community development block grant funds in the City of Troy CDBG Economic Development Revolving Loan Fund balance. The city does have a sufficient balance to allocate to this project. Also, the center has qualified for the use of CDBG funds. Staff feels that an application to use $120,000 of the revolving loan fund balance would be favorably considered. It is a recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to file an application with ODSA to use up to $120,000 from the City of Troy CDBG revolving loan fund balance for improvements to Lincoln Community Center, so that the application can be submitted and considered as soon as possible. We support emergency legislation. If the application is approved, the transfer of up to $120,000 to the Capital Improvement Fund would be handled through a future reappropriation. And this too is respectfully submitted by Mr. Swayzer, Mr. Sievert, and myself as chair.
Are there any questions from council? Do you have anything further, Mr. Kendall?
No, thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. The Recreation and Parks Committee has the next report from Chairman Mr. Brock Heath.
Thank you, Madam President. We have one item. On May 17th, this committee met to consider recommending an agreement for the 2018 Troy Strawberry Festival, TSF, that will include the downtown venue, the levee, and part of Treasure Island Park for Friday night activities. As in prior years, in the interest of preserving public safety and crowd management, some activities should be limited during the actual festival events and for an hour before and after the events of the day. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into an agreement regarding the Troy Strawberry Festival to be held within the levee area and the downtown, Market Street from Water Street to Staunton Road, closed for safety, and the ball field parking lot during 2018. that Park of Treasure Island Park be used for the Friday night activities and to include the limitation of some activities during and for the hour before and after each day's events activities. As the festival will be held in the first full weekend of June, we support emergency legislation on this. This is respectfully submitted by Mrs. Oda, Mr. Terwilliger, and myself as chair of this committee.
Are there any questions from council? Thank you, Mr. Heath.
Thank you, ma'am.
Streets and Sidewalks Committee and Chairman, Mr. Bobby Phillips, has our next report.
Thank you, Madam President. This is for discussion and report on the design of the Riverside Drive Improvement Project Phase 2. On May 17, the committee members Heath and Phillips met to consider recommending that a professional services agreement be authorized with the firm of LJB Inc. for the design of the Riverside Drive Improvement Project Phase 2 at a cost not to exceed $139,000. The project area is Riverside Drive between Orchard Drive and the existing widening north of the Riverside Cemetery entrance. The project scope includes the addition of curb and gutter, upgrade of a 6-inch water line to a 12-inch water main, installation of sanitary sewer in areas not currently served, and a shared use path on the west side of the road. The cost estimate exceeds the budgeted amount of $126,700, but the fund balances can accommodate the additional amount. And it is the recommendation of the committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into a professional services agreement with LJB Inc. of Miamisburg, Ohio, at a cost not to exceed $139,000 for the design of the Riverside Drive Improvement Project Phase 2. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Lutz, Mr. Heath, and myself as chair.
Are there any questions or comments from council?
Madam President, I have a question.
Yeah, Mr. Schweizer.
Will this go out to Duke Part, or does it stop right at Riverside?
No, this Phase 2 is anticipated to run, to go from roughly the entrance to the cemetery and community park out to approximately Orchard Lane, excuse me. To Duke Park is a second or a third phase after that, depending on the estimated cost through the design processes.
Would there be a savings in doing all the design work at once and then, because I know in like McKeag Avenue, we did it piecemeal. Would it be less expensive to do all of it at once? I mean, would there be a cost savings to us?
No, there really wouldn't, because the design elements are really the same. You know, you don't have an economies of scale because you're doing an extra half a mile. They still have to analyze where the utilities are, what the condition of the road, and they have to do that lane foot by lane foot. So there's no economies of scale.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Phillips. The last report tonight comes from the Utilities Committee and Chairman, Mr. John Terwilliger.
Thank you, Madam President. On May 17th, committee members Lutz and Terwilliger met to consider the recommendation that council approve wireless facilities legislation, which regulates certain wireless equipment within the rights of way and establishes an underground utility area within the city. New state legislation was signed on May 2nd to regulate such use of the rights of way and becomes effective 90 days thereafter. Within the 90-day windows, municipalities have enacted legislation that would give the municipalities some ability to regulate wireless equipment within the municipality's rights of way and establish underground utility areas. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared to regulate wireless equipment within the city of Troy, Ohio, rights of way, and establish underground utility areas. We recommend that council enact a new codified ordinance section, Chapter 921, small cell facilities and wireless support structures, and amend Section 903, underground utilities, to add a new subsection related to underground utilities within the public rights of way because of the timeline in which local legislation can be adopted. We support the legislation becoming presented as an emergency measure. This is respectfully submitted, Mr. Lutz, Mr. Twist, and myself as chair. Thank you.
Are there any questions from council?
Yes, Madam President, I have a couple.
Mr. Schweizer?
Is this something we're planning on doing, or this is just getting legislation in place? I mean, are we planning on putting in the downtown cell towers on the light poles and things like that at
No,
point?
this is really to piggyback on and clarify, I guess, what the state recently passed in terms of statewide small cell controls, processes, regulations, constraints, if you will, and uniformity with regards to the what they're calling the small cell technology, which deals with the 5G next gen cell towers, if you will. The towers, as the technology continues to evolve, those towers will become more compact, but in doing so will require more poles and more equipment closer and denser in location. Because of that, recognizing that it's municipal right-of-way, that we have home rule responsibilities, the municipalities were very concerned when the state passed their first round of legislation, which was overturned as being unconstitutional. And the new legislation allows us to create controls over our processes, as well as the design standards, and in some cases where we want the technology to actually be, or at least elements of the technology to be underground, to codify that within a 90-day window so that we're in compliance with the state law, but we have our own set of regulations that specify what we want. It is not us building that technology, it is us controlling and laying out the standards by which somebody can come and apply to build that technology in Troy.
So no one's approached us to do this yet? Would that be like a Verizon thing, or?
Yes, there are 5 eligible providers, Verizon being one of them, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint. Is it 4 or 5? 4 or 5, but they have to be approved for frequency at the state. That's what clarifies who can do that. There are builders, constructors that are working on their behalf. One of them has been in the region. One of them has approached us in the past about wanting to build that infrastructure. Mm-hmm. We've rejected their applications under the currently existing telecommunications ordinance that we have. That becomes obsolete in that within that next 90 days.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions from anyone? Okay. Thank you. We now open the meeting to citizen comments. At this time, does anyone in the audience have any questions or comments related to the agenda items this evening? If so, please come to the microphone and state your name and address. There is a 2-minute time limit at this point in the meeting, and Mr. Kerber is our timekeeper.
Lester Connor, 1210 South Clay Street, Troy, Ohio. On the Stonebridge Meadow, that's the one with the water problem out there on Finsbury? Is that it? No, it's not that one? Okay, thank you.
Anyone else in the audience have any comments at this point in the meeting? Seeing none, then we'll move on to resolutions and ask Mrs. Knight to read Resolution R-18, 2018.
Resolution number R-18, 2018, resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an agreement with LJB Inc. of Miamisburg, Ohio, for the design of the Riverside Drive Improvement Project Phase 2, cost not to exceed $139,000. First reading.
Are there any comments or questions from council?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Heath to suspend the rules. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Lutz,
Yes.
Mr. Heath,
Yes.
Mrs. Oda,
Yes.
Mr. Kendall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Schweizer and seconded by Mr. Twist to adopt the resolution. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Lutz,
Yes.
Mr. Heath,
Yes.
Mrs. Oda,
Yes.
Mr. Kendall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, please read Resolution R-19, 2018.
Resolution number R-19, 2018, resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to file an application for the use of PY 2018 Community Development Block Grant Funds. This would be an application for $150,000. This is the first reading.
Are there any comments from council?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Kendall and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to suspend the rules. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Lutz,
Yes.
Mr. Heath,
Yes.
Mrs. Oda,
Yes.
Mr. Kendall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
Move for adoption.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Kendall and seconded by Mr. Twist to adopt the resolution. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Heath,
Yes.
Mrs. Oda,
Yes.
Mr. Kendall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Lutz.
Yes.
The resolution is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, please read Resolution R-20, 2018.
Resolution number R-20, 2018, resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to file an application for the use of PY 2018 Community Development Block Grant Critical Infrastructure Funds for a water main replacement project. This would be an application for $500,000. This is the first reading.
Are there any questions or comments from council?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Schweizer and seconded by Mr. Sievert to suspend the rules. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Oda,
Yes.
Mr. Kendall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Lutz,
Yes.
Mr. Heath.
Yes.
Move for adoption.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Kendall and seconded by Mr. Twist to adopt the resolution. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Kendall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Lutz,
Yes.
Mr. Heath,
Yes.
Mrs. Oda.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, please read Resolution R-21, 2018.
Resolution number R-21, 2018, resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to file an application to the Ohio Development Services Agency, ODSA, for the use of a portion of the city's Economic Development Revolving Loan Fund balance for repair work to Lincoln Community Center and declaring an emergency. This will be an application to use up to $120,000 of the fund balance. This is the first reading.
Any comments or questions from council?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Kendall and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to suspend the rules. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Lutz,
Yes.
Mr. Heath,
Yes.
Mrs. Oda,
Yes.
Mr. Kendall.
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Schweizer and seconded by Mr. Terwilliger to adopt the resolution. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Lutz,
Yes.
Mr. Heath,
Yes.
Mrs. Oda,
Yes.
Mr. Kendall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Move on to ordinances and ask Mrs. Knight to read ordinance 018, 2018.
Ordinance accepting the final plat of Stonebridge Meadows Plan Development, Sections 6 and 7 in the city of Troy, Ohio, and dedicating right-of-way. This has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission, fourth reading.
Move for adoption.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Sievert to
I know
adopt the ordinance. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Lutz,
Yes.
Mr. Heath,
No.
Mrs. Oda,
Yes.
Mr. Kendall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, please read ordinance 022, 2018.
Ordinance number 022, 2018. Ordinance adopting and implementing Chapter 921 of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Troy, Ohio, and amending Section 903 of the Codified Ordinances of the City of Troy, Ohio, to add and implement subsection 903.27 regarding small cell facilities and wireless support structures and declaring an emergency. This is the first reading.
Any comments or questions from council?
Madam President, I ask this to go to a second reading.
Do we have any objection? Okay, so ordered. Mrs. Knight, please read ordinance 023, 2018.
Ordinance number 023, 2018. Ordinance changing the zoning of parcel number D0808058770 in lot number 7039, located at 530 Crescent Drive in the city of Troy, Ohio, from the zoning of OC1 Office Commercial District to the zoning of R7 Multiple Family Residential District. This has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission. Council will have a public hearing at the next council meeting.
This will go to a second reading. Mrs. Knight, please read ordinance 024, 2018.
Ordinance number 024, 2018, ordinance authorizing the use of public areas for the 2018 Troy Strawberry Festival and authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an agreement therefore and declaring an emergency. This is the first reading.
Are there any questions or comments from council?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Kendall to suspend the rules. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Sievert,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Lutz,
Yes.
Mr. Heath,
Yes.
Mrs. Oda,
Yes.
Mr. Kendall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger.
Yes.
Move for adoption.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Kendall and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to adopt the ordinance. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mr. Lutz,
Yes.
Mr. Heath,
Yes.
Mrs. Oda,
Yes.
Mr. Kendall,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mr. Swazer,
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger,
Yes.
Mr. Sievert.
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
That completes the business portion of tonight's meeting. Mrs. Knight, are there any communications or announcements?
No, there are not.
Mayor Beamish, do you have any comments for us this evening?
Just two, and we all know the sixth graders did get their trip. They are in Washington this week. They are coming back a day early, and I wanted to share with you that they will be placing a wreath at the Veterans Memorial in Riverside on Friday at 11:45. They'll be gathering, so they wanted to invite all of us if we'd like to participate in that. They'll bring the whole sixth grade down there, and that'll be their culminating activity for the trip. And again, on Friday, we will try again the Mayor's Float down the river of the Great Miami. I will mention, I think in the cards, it said 2017, that was last year. This is the second annual, so it's 2018. But if you'd like to still register, I do have cards available that tell you how to go about registering for that canoe, kayak, or whatever you want to do to get down the river, weather provided. Thank you.
Mr. Titterington, do you have any comments this evening?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one, at hopefully not significant risk to the credibility of the engineering staff. I do want to announce that it appears that the North Market Street project, Phase 2, is ahead of schedule. And weather permitting, should be open for, the lanes at least should be open for driving by July 4th, hopefully sooner. That doesn't mean the project is done. We do expect that we may have some intermittent lane closures from time to time as they wrap up the project. And we're waiting for the mast arms and the new stoplights and the new configuration to go out at Fossway and North Market. But again, weather permitting, the traffic, the road should be open by July 4th. That's all I have. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Director of Law, Mr. Kerber?
I have nothing this evening, Madam President. Thank you.
Thank you. City Auditor, Mr. Fergie?
Thank you, Madam President. I have nothing at this time.
Thank you. Are there any comments from council members this evening?
Madam President, I have a couple
Yeah,
of questions.
Mrs. Oda?
Patrick, on North Market, as you're approaching North Market, is the right-hand lane going to be a right turn only? I mean, it is obvious you can't go straight through in that right lane because the lane has been narrowed.
You mean as you're coming north to Fossway?
Yes.
That will be a drop lane at
So that will become a right turn only?
Yes.
And then, will the lights have arrows to allow left-hand turns and straight-through traffic?
I don't think we are having a dedicated left lane because I don't think it's warranted there. It's only if there's that much traffic that we would need to do that. However,
There's a lot
the
of
newer
people that turn left
technology,
there.
well, there are now because they can't go straight, but if it does become warranted at that later date, then we should easily be able to add that function because the newer technology allows us to do that fairly economically. But we'll double check the plans to see. You don't want to put that in if we don't have to.
I mean, you get people you're going to have that left lane, everybody going straight, people turning into Speedway, people turning left at the light, and it just, I'm skeptical, but I'll give you the time to figure it out.
Well, where you need to worry about is how much traffic is coming south through the intersection. And so we do traffic counts. We had our traffic engineer look at it. We will take a look at the
pay
plans
attention
again,
to it.
and I'll email you and let you know for sure. But I don't think we did that.
Okay. My other question is downtown with the reworking the roundabout. The article in the paper doesn't really talk about an exact cost. Can we get an exact cost of how much all that work is going to cost? I mean, you say a few $1,000s, but...
Well, it's basically, we purchased a used asphalt grinder because it was about half the cost of what it would have cost to have somebody come in and do it for us. And it is a piece of equipment that we will be able to use in the street department elsewhere, and I believe that was an $8,000 one-time cost. We do have the cost of new striping, paint, and/or tape. And then, of course, there's a staff time of just removing the lights and some traffic engineering to make sure that we're designing it accurately or to standards. That's why it was an estimate in the paper, because some of the costs we know, some of the costs, are billable by the
But will you let us
engineer,
know that
but
when
it's
costs
not-
are final?
Can, sure.
That'd be
I mean,
great.
it is relatively minor.
Are we putting in pedestrian-activated flashers? I haven't seen that.
We are not. We're not putting those in, but we will have a lot of signage. We will have the refuge areas in the middle of the crosswalks on either side. So we opted, I believe the traffic engineer recommended against putting the rapid flashing beacons in.
So people just have to step out into traffic.
Well, yes, except we don't advise them stepping out into traffic. We advise them to wait until the traffic passes, of course, but we don't anticipate that it's going to be a highway either.
You were wrong.
Couldn't have timed that better.
Okay.
But they can always walk down to the light, which is.
There are still lights 1 block away, that's correct. And
use a
the ability to stop in the middle of the crosswalk, as well as the fact that they will only have to be crossing 1 active lane instead of 2 in each direction.
Look
will
left,
shorten-
get to the middle, and then look to your right and finish crossing. Okay.
That's the way you should be doing it, yes.
All right. I just know we had talked about the pedestrian-activated flashers, and I didn't see that, so I just wondered. Thank you.
Any other questions from council members?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Phillips?
Thank you. Mr. Titterington, on the page, I don't know, way down there, 66 in our packet, the violation activity summary, is there a reason that it went to a random assortment of stuff instead of by ward? We used to have them sorted by ward.
I asked them, well, and we can go back to that,
you
but
would.
the last 4 or 5 questions that I've received related to properties and whether or not they have been notified have been by addresses. And so we wanted to try it this way so that when council, rather than worrying about their wards and trying to find the address within their wards, they can just go to the address itself and note which ward it's in, because that column will remain. But given that I believe we've got 122, I think, is what violations this 2-week period, given that we're in spring and people have kind of gotten behind on the tall grass, we thought this would be a little more expeditious way of finding an address.
Well, the only way I would see a rationale behind it was the numerical number of the street, not by street name, not by ward, not by date or anything, but it's just in a numerical order of address.
I believe it is.
Okay. Personally, I would prefer ward. I don't know how the other folks.
That's fine. You can just email me your preference. It doesn't matter. We
Thank
can
you.
resort it any way you want to.
With my iPad, it's not set up for separating well. Thank you, appreciate it.
Any other comments from council members? Do we have any comments from city staff this evening? Any comments from the audience this evening?
Bill McIntosh, 1323 Surrey Road, Troy. I take off my news reporter hat again for 2 items. First of all, my wife Kathy and I would like to invite council to the opening concert of the 2018 summer season of the Troy Civic Band. It will be Memorial Day, Monday, May 28th, 7 o'clock at Treasure Island Park. We promise you a G-rated program, unlike Mr. Carrington's program the other night. But I did see a sailor blush. But we have a nice program planned, and we will also be paying tribute to a young man that we lost in our band family this year, Kyle DeVilbus, who served as our MC for 11 years after being in our clarinet section. Kyle lost his fight with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy January 3rd, and so we will be paying tribute to him on the program. Another item that I would like to bring before council very quickly, I get a lot of compliments from friends and family from outside of Troy about how just about every approach into the city is very nice looking and pretty, except for one. We have a junkyard situation on South County Road 25A. It's called Trojan City Auto, next to what used to be Irwin Chrysler. As you know, there is a field full of vehicles behind it. I'm not saying anything against a man's right to make his living, but it looks like a junkyard. And I think the folks that live on Boone Hill and that area there deserve a little bit better neighborly activities than having a junkyard at their doorstep. I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you all, and I wish you well for the rest of the week.
Thank you, Bill. Anyone else in the audience have any comments this evening?
Mickey Hammer, 1160 Red Maple Drive. I just got a question about the plot 6 and 7 for Stonebridge Meadows. 2 weeks ago, when we were here, there was some talk about some give and take, and there was talk about perhaps some timelines that could be put in place. I didn't hear anything about that tonight. I expected to hear that before a vote was taken. I guess that's my fault for not speaking up sooner. But has that actually happened? Is there some timelines that can be, that the builder or the developer is going to be held to based on all the escrow money that's being held now?
Mr. Kerber, do you want to address that, or Mr. Titterington? Mr. Titterington?
Throwing it my way. We have not gotten any final timelines yet. Now that the 6 and 7 has been approved, we will be reworking the escrow agreement and including that and monitoring that as part of the work that they're going to do with 6 and 7.
So that means no, there hasn't been any timelines established for when that work has to be completed.
Right, that's, yeah, correct. I apologize, I thought I said that at the beginning, but no, we do not have firm numbers, dates yet. We're going to continue to work with Choice One, the engineer.
Okay.
And that will be folded into the whole escrow arrangement as we manage the project moving forward.
So was that even considered as part of the approval process? Or was that kind of only brought up last week and never considered again?
Well, there are certain, in the plan development section of the ordinances, there are provisions for the enforcement of the plan developments, and there is certainly an awareness on all parties that if an applicant for a PD doesn't follow through with the plans, that there are certain enforcement that can be looked at, and that's part of the ongoing discussion. I haven't been a part of that, but my understanding staff has had multiple discussions in that regard.
Has that ever happened to anybody who has put together a plan development in Troy?
Historically, I can't answer that.
So it's something that can be done, but it's never been done. Is that accurate?
I'd have to research that. I can't think of that off the top of my head. We don't have that many PDs.
Okay.
But
Again,
we
my-
have standard residential
Yeah.
subdivisions, you know, it's very similar.
Mhm.
And so, you know, I'm sure we've had similar type arrangements, but on the standard conventional side rather than PDs.
Okay. So my concern that I brought up before still is my concern that this won't get fixed the proper way, and there's no recourse to stop her from finishing the plan development and basically going away and handing it over to the homeowners association that would then take over and, from what I understand, be liable for those things. So I think we're going to end up catching the flack on that. So I don't know what else to say. Thank you.
I think maybe one of the, Madam Chair, one of the questions was, one of the items in the existing agreement was waiting for drier weather. How do we understand what drier weather means? And that seems very, just whenever they choose, basically, at that point.
Well, I mean, it does. I mean, they've got to work that into their contractor's plans. I agree. I will say, though, that we do have a letter from Choice One that lays out the improvements that they've agreed to do on behalf of the developer. That list also includes the line that we propose that these items be added to the Phase 6 escrow agreement so they can be installed during drier weather. Okay, there's your drier weather, but my point is that it will be added to the escrow agreement, and the stick that we have is withholding, releasing those escrow
funds.
amounts.
Right.
So ultimately, you know, the bank will not be allowed to release that portion unless the city engineer and I sign off on it.
Saying that those were done correctly.
Exactly.
Right.
So is there a difference between the drier weather required to dig foundations versus fix the drainage issues?
That I can't answer.
Yeah, it just seems like if you can dig for one, you should be able to dig for the other. So, again, it seems like one thing takes precedence and something that should be taken care of isn't taking precedence.
Well,
So
except
that's just my view.
the foundations are being built by one company, the home builder, as opposed to the subdivider. They're two different.
But dry weather's dry weather, and digging is digging.
I don't.
All right. Thank you.
Madam President, has there been escrow deposits
We've had escrow amounts for the,
in this issue?
I don't believe that we finalized the escrow amounts for 6 and 7 yet. That'll be the next step now that this is approved.
Mr. Carter, 1210 South Clay Street, Troy, Ohio. To continue on this same thing here, I think Ms. Oda brought it up and went to the 4th reading for them to show some actions and making good faith that they was going to do something. And I think Mr. Heath here had the same problem with them, or was going to do this. And now it seems like you're throwing those off to the side and you passed it. So I thought really you guys was trying to do something right this time, but it looks like you just caved in again. Thank you.
Kathy Roeder, 189 Little John. I am here tonight on behalf of the Troy Strawberry Festival, and I just wanted to publicly thank you again for the ongoing partnership with the City of Troy. Specifically want to thank the city departments and staff for their ongoing support. This will be our 42nd year, and we truly could not do this festival without the city, so thank you.
Thank you. Any further comments or questions? Thank you all for attending tonight's meeting. Have a safe and peace-filled week. Meeting adjourned.